Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. For those of you who have been here for our Music and Home series, this is the third in 4 parts. And we have been looking into the many ways in which music can communicate a sense of home and how composers invest their own sense of home within their music. Today, we're very fortunate. We're going to have some special guests. Both the CLAREMONT Trio and clarinetist KINAN AZMEH will be here with us. How many of you heard KINAN play on Saturday night? Oh, quite a few of you were there. Great. Okay, wonderful. So you've heard him before. He's going to play and also speak with you about his home culture of Syria and also how his music has changed since he's come to live in this country. And that's probably a pretty good starting point for today in terms of composers and their changing sense of home. We discussed in the first class how home can be a relatively complicated concept for us because it can change over time. Our sense of what home is can definitely change. We started the class by looking into a few works that demonstrated different ways in which composers can give you a feeling of home in music. We found, first of all, in a work by Kevin Putz, literally called Home for string quartet, that music that is harmonious, resonant, regular in rhythm, easygoing, very much puts us at home as listeners. We feel the music is stable, it's happy with where it is, and we feel happy with what we're hearing as a result. We also looked into how composers use a sense of home key in their music. A starting place for the piece. It usually starts in one particular key, moves away from that key during the piece, and then comes back to it at the end of the piece. And most music composed before 1900 does just that. Then we looked at how musical themes can be like a protagonist, like a person, a theme, even just a few notes that guide you through the piece, and it seems like those notes are going somewhere, going through a series of adventures, let's say, and come to rest at the end. And then finally, and this is something we'll look into quite a bit today, markers of locality. Anything in music which is identified with a particular place or a particular culture can definitely give the listener a sense that the music is in that place, or maybe it expresses the composer's home identity. And we've seen examples of that. The last example here, Dvorak's American Quartet, we spent quite a bit of time last time looking into that particular piece and found that Dvorak had traveled to the Midwest of the United States and quickly became at home in a small town in Iowa called Spillville. It's as small as it sounds. And Dvorak spent several weeks there, and it was a Czech community, so he could speak the language with some of the people who lived there, but he transcribed bird sounds that he heard walking in the fields, and those found their way into the quartet. Now, Dvorak is a great example of this kind of complicated sense of home because we hear both the evocation of American music in his so-called American Quartet, the sound of African-American spirituals, for example, and we looked into the scale degrees that he uses to give you a sense of that music. And nevertheless, it still sounds like the Dvorak that we know from his earlier music before he ever came to the United States. I think that's a great example of how home can become complicated when one person moves from one culture to another. How many of you have moved your home during the course of your life? Oh, okay, all right. So pretty much, so you haven't lived in Skaneateles your whole lives. Okay. I think that's fairly common, and you might think about your sense of home and how that has changed over time when you've moved from one place to another. The new home can have as powerful an impact on you as where you came from. So the Dvorak scholar, Michael Beckerman, pointed out that, quote, Dvorak probably had a more comprehensive and profound grasp of African-American music than he did of any folk music in the Czech lands. He never studied Bohemian folk music. He grew up hearing it occasionally, but he studied African-American spirituals very closely, as we saw last week, and had a real grasp of them in his effort to create a music which was distinctly and deliberately American. Some of you asked me after class last time, did the composers who studied with Dvorak continue along those lines, using African-American spirituals as the basis for future music. And a couple of them did, people like Florence Price, William Grant Still. But something profound and a profound change happened shortly after Dvorak was here. And that's where I want to start class today. That's the emergence of jazz. Jazz came to, of course, we think of the sort of the foundation of jazz coming out of New Orleans. But in 1917, a band from New Orleans came to New York City. And jazz really caught on there like wildfire, and really gave composers a new sense of American identity and a way to ground their music in a particular place. And that's what I'd like to start with today, is a piece that we heard in the first week at the festival, Rhapsody in Blue. It's probably something many of you have heard many times. But what I'd like to look into with you is how Gershwin tried to encapsulate a sense of place in this piece. And he did this very deliberately, actually. He was asked to write a jazz concerto. Now, the whole idea of a jazz concerto was kind of a hybrid of two things, right? We have the classical piano concerto, think Mozart, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff, whose music was in vogue at the time Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue, and jazz, which is, comes out of popular music, that has several different diverse sources that converged into that music. And Gershwin said right away that he wanted this new piece to reflect his home, what he called America, a kaleidoscope of America. But I think really for Gershwin it meant New York City, because that's the place he was from, he grew up in, he lived there. It was an urban environment as opposed to the more rural environment that Dvorak was depicting in his sense of home. So to give a contrast with the urban and the rural, I'd like to consider Gershwin. Now, jazz had burst on the scene in the 1920s in New York City, and people like Duke Ellington were really popularizing it. They were playing it in nightclubs, especially in Harlem. You may have heard the Cotton Club here, pictured in the 1920s. And this is how most people thought of jazz in the 20s. It was music to dance to. It was not music for the concert hall. And there was a big question at the time, can jazz be music for the concert hall? This is typical of the mindset at the time, a little cartoon from the leading music publication, Musical America, in 1926, shortly after Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue. And there's if you can't see it, it's backstage at the concert hall, the conductor's peeking out, and there's a little baby with jazz written and carrying a bunch of loud instruments. And this guy is saying, come on, buddy, I'll leave you with some real nice people. And jazz is going in the back door of the concert hall, okay? Now, and the people chasing behind because they're so thrilled about jazz and they can't get enough of it, okay? Now, there's a lot encoded into this cartoon from the 1920s. We won't get into all of it. There's definitely a racial component, which is that jazz started as a black American music and then became very popular with white audiences. So going in the back door of something has a certain connotation. But also the question of whether jazz could be integrated into the classical music tradition was an open question. And Gershwin really wanted to get in on this and prove that, in fact, jazz and the foundation of jazz could move beyond the concert hall. But he was not the only one. He was asked to do this by Paul Whiteman, who put together an orchestra of mostly white musicians, which integrated jazz instruments, like the saxophones you can see, with classical instruments, the violins, the piano, to unite the sound of the two together. And he was the one that asked Gershwin to compose this so-called jazz concerto. He had rented Aeolian Hall. Aeolian was a big manufacturer of player pianos, which were really the way a lot of people heard music at the time. This is before the phonograph became widespread. Anyways, this hall, Whiteman had rented, and he was going to call the concert, quote, an experiment in modern music. If you heard that as a concert title, I don't know, would you go? You might be a little questionable. But in any case, Gershwin wrote the piece for this in the format of a concerto. It was orchestrated by Paul Whiteman's band leader, Ferdy Grofé. And a lot of people came to this concert. You know, two people, I'll tell you who was there. The violinist Fritz Kreisler came, great violinist, and the composer Sergei Rachmaninoff showed up. So he was interested too, like, what is this guy gonna do with the piano concerto? Isn't that interesting? You imagine Rachmaninoff sitting, listening to Gershwin play Rhapsody in Blue. But that gives us actually one thread of where this music is coming from, out of the Romantic Piano Concerto. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. Anyways, Gershwin set to work on this concerto, and I just want to tell you just a brief word about Gershwin. His original family name was Gershowitz. He was from a Russian Jewish immigrant family in Brooklyn. That was his background. Will you hear that in Rhapsody in Blue? I can't find it. If you can hear the sound of, you know, klezmer music, good luck. I can't. But Gershwin was really born and raised in New York City. He started his career as a teenager as a so-called song plugger. Song pluggers were hired to play into piano rolls the latest tunes, and then those piano rolls could be sold, and on your player piano at home, you could play the roll and enjoy the latest music. Well, Gershwin learned all of the latest music doing that. Then he started to write his own songs, and he was very good at that, as you probably know. He had his first hit in 1920, and very quickly had a string of successes, both popular songs and also musicals. So by 1924, when Paul Whiteman asked him to write this jazz concerto, he was well known as a popular songwriter, but not as a jazz musician and not as a classical composer. So this was something really new and very ambitious for him. What was he going to do? Well, his ambition in part was to create a work which would encapsulate life at the time. That is his sense of home, in particular New York City, but what he called America, quote, a kaleidoscope of America. Now, how would he do this? Well, he talked about it later, and he said that it was actually on the train that he got his first inspiration for this. It was on the train with its steely rhythms, its rattly bang that is so stimulating to a composer. And then he says, a little aside, I frequently hear music in the very heart of noise. How many composers say that? Not many. Then I suddenly heard, and even saw on paper, the complete construction of Rhapsody from beginning to end. I want to start with these steely rhythms. Have any of you taken the subway in New York City? Okay, so you know something about these steely rhythms that can come when the train goes over the track. In Rhapsody in Blue, we have a pretty clear indication of that about halfway through the piece. The themes come to a stop, and suddenly Gershwin goes like this. Now, he writes a cello rondo. If you think of a train, what does a train do, right? It goes from the station and it starts speeding up. So he writes. From earlier in the piece. So that could be a starting point for Gershwin here. We're in an urban environment, there's a lot of noise. Okay, we have the sound of the train going forward as the train goes across the track. This is certainly one aspect of the piece that defines it and moves throughout it. But there are others as well. Think of New York City in the 1920s. It's really the era of steel. We have skyscrapers coming up for the first time in New York City. This was represented in art by a few people. Fernand Léger, the French painter, settled in New York City in part because he was so excited about the place and thought that it could be depicted in art in various ways. We see all of the colorful buildings and the streetscape. You see images of people kind of coming together. Now, this is a very modernist view of New York City, but Gershwin was well aware of this, and there's some modernist touches in Rhapsody in Blue as well. A lot of the art of the time shows New York street scenes with all the colors coming together, a kind of, Gershwin's term for it was melting pot. We don't use that so much anymore, but the idea that many different peoples are coming together in one particular place. The New Brooklyn Bridge, of course, impressing everyone. And even Glez depicted jazz, composition for jazz. So we can see that there was something about life at the time, the excitement of the urban environment, all of the clashes, the loud sounds, the rhythms, were coming together, and Gershwin sought to encapsulate this into musical form. Now, there's a lot else in Rhapsody in Blue that he strings together to give us a sense of home. One is certainly the blues. Now, the blues have their roots in the American South. It's defined primarily by a 7-note scale, which Gershwin uses at the start of Rhapsody in Blue. You'll hear it here. Okay, the notes of the blues scale. So there's 7 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're different than the usual scale, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's a typical scale used in classical music. So Gershwin is taking the blues scale and in a way sort of substituting it for the classical scale. Now he still uses the classical scale. For example, at the very start of Rhapsody in Blue, it starts with a trill. In the orchestra part, of course, it's so wonderful, it's a slide, right? It's a famous slide. But in the piano version, it sounds like this. Okay? But that scale, that's the classical scale from classical music. So he really uses both together, again, uniting the sound of classical music with the sound of jazz. But there are many other ways he does this too, throughout the entire piece. One of the fonts of the blues at this particular time was the work of W.C. Handy. His St. Louis Blues was a huge hit, and in the melody there, you can see these blues are used and were popularized already. This is from 1914, so 10 years before Rhapsody in Blue. And we can definitely hear the sound of the blues come throughout Rhapsody in Blue in various ways. And I just wanted to give you a couple examples of that. Another one that's really comes in a lot in the piece is something called stride piano. Has anybody heard of stride piano? It's a certain kind of much thicker textured piano playing which became popular in the 1920s thanks in particular to the work of, bound to get my exercise today, James P. Johnson. We heard on Saturday's program a week and a half ago a short work by James P. Johnson, the Charleston. He was the one who wrote the first Charleston. You've heard of the dance, the Charleston? Well, it was a piece of music first that he created, and he was the expert and creator of stride piano. It was based in part on ragtime, but it used a much thicker sound by having the left hand constantly jump up and down across the keyboard. And so it almost sounds like 3 hands, because the right hand is doing this, and the left hand is leaping around. Let me give you just a little excerpt of the Charleston so you can hear what that sounds like. Again, we heard an orchestrated version in the concert the other night. This is the piano roll that James P. Johnson recorded himself. So this is the kind of thing, if you had a player piano, you could play this role in your own home and hear what he was doing. Here's a little bit of that. Okay, very catchy, isn't it? The rhythm here, 1, 2, da da, 1, 2, and da da da. It always hits on the and of 2. If we're doing 1, 2, 3, 4, da 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 da. That kind of syncopation was very popular because of this piece in particular. And Gershwin uses it as well, especially in a passage like this. 1, da. That's on the and of 2. 1, 2, and. So he uses the same rhythm there. And these leaps, which Gershwin uses all the way through Rhapsody in Blue, really come out of the style of James P. Johnson, who would use the stride technique. Comes out of stride piano, which was big in the 1920s. So Gershwin took these different threads in addition to the sound of the Romantic Piano Concerto. And for that, I think one of the inspirations was probably someone like Sergei Rachmaninoff. So if you hear... Oops, that's not good. I want to break the technology there. Excuse me. These kinds of big chords that Gershwin uses, and in the orchestra. Sound quite similar to if you listen to Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto or the First. Which were also quite popular at this time. So all of these threads, Gershwin is bringing together into a whole. And in terms of making it a kaleidoscope or giving you a sense of New York City, one of the things he does is to put these different elements together into what he calls a rhapsody. Now, rhapsody is not a specific musical form. It's actually quite free. That's the defining characteristic of a rhapsody, is that you could be rhapsodic, right? You can go in any direction you want. And so what Gershwin does is he introduces his themes actually very naturally in the beginning. You wouldn't even notice, listening to the opening of Rhapsody in Blue, that it contains like 7 different themes that Gershwin then puts together in closer and closer proximity as the piece goes along, so that by the end, there's this culminating sense of all the themes coming together in a very short space of time. Almost like walking through the city, you know, a crowded environment again, and you see all of those different elements right before you, all crowded together. So in that sense, I would say this is a very urban representation of home. The elements come together one after another in very close proximity. And I want to be mindful of the time because we have our guests waiting. I'm just going to give you a little example of that toward the end of the piece, where these themes come together, and you might even count, you know, how many themes can you hear in close proximity. Listen for the way the music is constantly changing from one moment to the next. So I don't know if you counted the themes. I lost count. But you can see the ideas are coming so quickly, one after another. And one reason it doesn't feel disjointed is because we've heard them all before, earlier in the piece. And so gradually there's this sense of culmination that everything is coming together in close proximity. And that's what it's like being in a city. And that's what it's like when you feel at home in a city, finally, that you're comfortable with all of these elements coming together. The Central European classical tradition, these different elements of jazz, the blues, and the steely rhythms of the train, even, you have in there. So it's a wonderful representation of home, and one that's very different from the Dvorak American Quartet we heard last time. I'd like to move forward in time just a few years, actually, to another composer whose music we're going to hear on Thursday night, Aram Khachaturian. He was born in Tbilisi in Georgia, and he wrote this trio just several years after Rhapsody in Blue. And Kinan was the one who mentioned that to me, and he's absolutely right. It was composed not long after Rhapsody in Blue. Khachaturian was Armenian, and Armenia is very close to present-day Georgia. The pianist in the Claremont trio, Sofiko, is from Tbilisi, or from Georgia, where Khachaturian grew up. It's a little bit of geography here. So we're talking in this general region. I will, here's the larger map. You can see we're somewhere south of Russia, east of Turkey, and north of the other of the Middle Eastern countries there. Khachaturian would go on to become one of the leading Soviet composers of mid-century, along with Prokofiev and Shostakovich. They were really the three big ones. Kabalevsky also a little bit. And his music came to represent the Soviet Union, but he really was very successful in keeping his music always grounded in his sense of home, which meant for him Armenian culture and Georgian history. He was particularly inspired by the ashug tradition, which apparently in Arabic, ashug means love or in love. But really what the ashug were troubadours who would travel and perform their own songs with their own instrumental accompaniment throughout the region. And these singers used a couple of instruments, and you might hear some echoes of these instruments today. First of all, they used a certain kind of lute, which is a long-necked lute. It's different than the Arabic oud, which is a short-necked lute. And these were typically tuned in fourths, and we're going to hear a lot of the interval of the fourth used in Khachaturian's music. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. We also have in this music the bowed instrument, the spiked fiddle. And when it comes to the modern violin, the sound of this instrument can be heard as well. The most famous ashug in Georgian culture was Sayat Nova. He lived in the 18th century, and he wrote his own poems, which are really marvelous. So they're studied in literature as well as in music. You can see him here carrying this spiked bowed fiddle, and he would accompany himself with that. I wanted to give you a little bit of this music because Khachaturian heard this music as a child. He did not originally study music. He went to study biology in Moscow, go figure. Then in 1929, he heard in Moscow a group of these ashug musicians play. And it reminded him of his childhood. And in that very year, he started studying at the Moscow Conservatory. He switched from biology to music, which was risky on his part because he was already 26 years old. But he was dedicated to music and found new ways of incorporating some of these songs into music. I wanted to play just a little excerpt of a song by Sayat Nova. We have over 220 of them have survived. This is the Sayat Nova Ensemble playing a little of this music. You can listen for some of the instruments, the lute as well as the bowed violin, and also it gives you a sense of the singing style, which is picked up in the piece we'll hear by the clarinet. sorry about that. Okay, then the faster, more dance-like music returns again and is suspended. And that framework Khachaturian uses a lot in his music. He'll have these dance rhythms which are sort of pulsating, and then things will stop and there's a sort of more vocal, melismatic singing quality where there are these melismas that just rise and fall, and if they sound Arabic to you, it is possible that the musical influence of this region came into this music as well. Khachaturian said himself that he was inspired in his harmonic language, which is the harmonies of the music, from, quote, imagining the sounds of folk instruments with their characteristic tuning and resulting range of overtones. So the way these instruments resonated led him to create certain harmonies. And we can hear that in the start of the trio, where there are these chords, which I guess you won't hear because they're playing a different movement, but we have the sound of these chords from the very beginning, which are in fourths. So this kind of sound is very common in Khachaturian's music, as opposed to the sound in thirds, which we're used to, where we have chords built in thirds, right? 1, 2, 3, or in Gershwin's case, those are thirds. So Khachaturian's music, this sound is something that he uses to evoke his own home culture. You may also have noticed that the singer, in this case, if we can imagine Sayat Nova and singing his troubadour songs, the violin part often echoes the vocal part, right? You hear the voice first and then the violin echoes. And that's also something we're going to hear a lot of in this trio, where the clarinet is sort of the leader and the violin echoes, and they create a kind of polyphony or multiple melodies going on with each other. So that's a little introduction to Khachaturian. I am so pleased and grateful that our performers have been willing to join us today. We have here both the Claremont Trio and KINAN AZMEH. First, we're going to invite up the pianist and violinist, Sofiko and Emily, along with KINAN, to play some of the Khachaturian Trio. if you could stay, yeah. Thank you, yeah. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for your performance and for being here. Kinan, perhaps we could start with you. I think you were the one who chose this piece, and I'm just interested in, what resonates with you in this music.
Thank you, Aaron. It's great to be here. And this piece, actually, I grew up somehow with this piece. Growing up in Damascus, I was always looking for pieces where the composers are trying to get in touch with their origins somehow. And I get spoiled because I have there are maybe 4 pieces that are really amazing for this combination. One of them is Khachaturian. The other one is Bartok Contrasts, where Bartok also is digging into his own roots, if you like. But the first time I played this piece was in my late teens, and then I played it over and over. So every time I have a chance to program it, I will always bring it. And especially, actually, this opening of the third movement is a wonderful example of how a clarinet can wear another hat, if you like, where the clarinet can sound like other instruments. And in this case, there are so many ways you can play this opening. Just to give you a very quick example, like as a classical performer, it can be simply. That's what's written. The moment you know the background of the composer and where he's from, you can channel other elements if you like. And I'm not suggesting that one version is better than the other, but it's nice to see pieces that have this window that allow you to dig deeper into what's behind the actual composition.
Thank you for that. That's fascinating. I was thinking about that relative to the violin too, Emily. You're playing so refined and wonderful and using the modern violin. Are there any things you do to try to make it sound more folk-like or more, direct?
Well, this piece is newer to me, so I'm still kind of figuring it out, but definitely a lot of rhythmic freedom, a lot of kind of playing around with the rhythms and the way that things kind of push up against each other, and you can also the quality of sound sometimes, the slides you might use, the danciness of some of it, all of that contributes to the style of the piece, I think.
So the rhythm is a big part of embodying
rhythm is a big part,
folk.
and a lot of this feels very sort of improvisatory, or like you can kind of play around with it. Which is fun to perform.
Geographically, Sofiko, this music is probably closest to where you're from.
Yes, I'm very proud of that, yes. So Khachaturian was actually born and raised in Tbilisi, where I'm from, and I go there every year to visit my mother. It's very similar in the way that he uses his melodies. It sounds very native to me, and I imagine since it's his early work, one of the first works he composed, that he was very much inspired by folk melodies of Georgian flavor, so to say. And the rhythm, just to add to the rhythm that was mentioned, it really feels in a way quite almost primitive, I would say, because one could just get up and make those rhythms with clapping hands or on like the body rhythms. They could tap on the rhythms, and that would become the basis of the entire work. Yeah.
When you were growing up in Georgia, was folk music a part of the culture in the city, or is that something that's more distant?
Oh, absolutely. Music is part of daily life in Georgia. We celebrate with music, and if you are ever at a Georgian supra, what we call a dinner feast, people would start singing or get up and start dancing. It's part of the tradition and part of the culture, and it's really such a huge part in the folklore. The polyphonic folklore is such a huge part of our daily life. We celebrate, we mourn with it, and we find solace in a way in music. There is, for example, a piece by Sultan Sinsadze, one of the classical 20th century Georgian composer, five pieces for cello and piano. And the first piece is called Urmuli, which is basically a song that a villager would sing on a carriage while going home from his long day on the farm. And it's a very solemn, sad song, probably to comfort him or herself during this trip. So yes, it's definitely part of our culture and big part of our tradition.
Thank you for sharing that. We're going to hear some music by KINAN in a moment, and I wonder, KINAN, if you might be willing to share a little bit about the sounds that you heard when you were growing up in Damascus. We got a taste of that the other night with your suite for improviser and orchestra, the sounds of the market even, not only musical sounds. But could you maybe share a little bit about your background?
So, I mean, I have an interesting sonic background, if you like. I grew up in Damascus. Damascus, in the capital of Syria, the oldest continuously inhabited capital city in the world. And it's not only known for Arabic music. There are lots of other trends or other currents of musical vocabularies going on, namely Arabic, but also lots of Kurdish music, Armenian music, also ancient Aramaic singing. I mean, Aramaic is still spoken in the outskirts of Damascus. So I grew up surrounded by all of that, but I never paid attention to it. I was studying in a conservatory, learning, you know, what is commonly known as the Western classical music. And I chose this instrument, which has absolutely nothing to do with Arabic music. And my parents, my dad, the first piece of music actually I heard was Night on a Bold Mountain, Mussorgsky's. And my dad used to pretend to be a conductor. So he will make my sister and I sit while he conducts the loudspeakers. That was our entryway into classical music. And we started learning instruments. There was not, at the time, a conservatory that will teach you Arabic music. So we went with whatever was methodically taught. But then, I think it's a classic case where you discover the museum of your own city after you leave that city. When I moved to the US for my grad school, that's when I became more interested in Arabic music. And that's when I started to study it more seriously. Now the music that I think that I write is music I like to hear. You know, to put it simply, it's music that reflects my different interests. Certainly there's Arabic music in there, some, of course, classical influences, but also sometimes people find Armenian influences, jazz influences, you name it. And the piece you heard, you know, those of you who were at the concert on like just a couple of days ago, that was all original music inspired by the multitude of traditions one can find. So this has been my, you know, upbringing musically, a lot of everything pretty much, with a focus on the classical music vocabulary. But I continue to believe that music forms a continuum, and I don't think there's a real line between jazz and classical music. I mean, Gershwin is a wonderful example. Nor there's a line that separates East from West or North from South. It's all musical vocabularies that we use in a specific parts geographically. But especially with today's world, I think we're all now multilingual in a way. And I try to celebrate that in the music I'm making.
That's wonderful to hear about and inspiring. In this class, which we're calling Music at Home, we've looked at some composers who changed their environment over the course of their life. We looked into Chopin and how Chopin grew up with these sounds of Polish music, but then he moved to France and was in a completely different musical environment, and his music changed and morphed. We saw that with Dvorak when he came to the United States. We think of his so-called American style, and yet he retained something of where he came from as well. I wonder if you might speak briefly before we hear this piece about what has changed when you moved here, first for school, and then you've been living here for quite a long time, and this is your home now, if I may say, right? Is that fair to say? What has changed in your musical world and your sense of home?
I mean, that's a huge topic. It will take hours to define what home is and what home not. But one thing I'm very comfortable saying is home is an ever-expanding concept. You know, you start when you're born, where you're born maybe is home, but then the places you interact with. And now for me, home is the place you would like to contribute to without having to justify it. And contributing can take any form. Playing is one of the ways you can contribute to the well-being of a society. So now I feel very much at home right here in this room. And anywhere I play, anywhere I have meaningful interaction. Musically speaking, what changed wasn't about where I was geographically. It was about where I was emotionally. For example, lots of my music, when I started composing, which is started at a later stage, so I started when I was already in the US. So I was starting writing about home from maybe a nostalgic perspective, you know. But then I used to bring lots of these pieces to my Arabic jazz quartet in New York to try to workshop these pieces. So some elements from the city where I was were present in the music I'm writing. When the uprising began in 2011 in Syria, most of my music became about that, trying to bring attention to that. But then later on I realized that you cannot also be held hostage by tragedy either. You know, it's making music is an act of freedom, I think, and to practice that freedom means sometimes to forget the tragedy itself. You're not running away from it, but to try to celebrate something else. So the music changes in relation to who I'm interacting with, who I'm playing with, but also what I'm dealing with conceptually at the moment. And it doesn't have to be a tragedy only. You know, I think all of us life goes through all of these things. And music can reflect all of these things, but also you can have a larger perspective, I think, on the world. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question. But
gives us a lot to think about. Perhaps you could set the stage for this piece, which also has kind of particular geographic basis or a basis in time and where you were.
Absolutely. This piece was written during the pandemic, at a time where I think our concept of home changed. The world became just a 2 blocks radius, and the universe is basically the neighbors upstairs and downstairs from you. And you know, we freaked out, like many people, and also there was no work suddenly. I was commissioned to write a bunch of pieces, and I tried to just celebrate this new world of mine. And one of these elements was being in solitude. The title of the piece is Essays on Solitude and Other Ambiguous Emotions. Solitude not being a negative, and solitude, you know, it's not lonely. Just the state of being alone and embracing that and what that brings. And this happened in an interesting contrast with what happened in my personal life, where my wife and I had our first kid. So suddenly the world was expanding in an unbelievable way versus the world on the exterior, which was shrinking. So this piece is in 3 movements. We're going to play only one for you. For the other 2, you have to come to the concert on Thursday. So this is the teaser. And there are 3 slow movements. So I want you to just basically sit back. Maybe there's nothing happening in this piece. It's a very much of an introverted look at the world and celebrating that. Another thing I wanted to say about the piece is, so the middle movement, which is the fast movement, also is not fast. All of it is just about trying to create a sonic sound together. And in that sense, I'm using elements from what you find in traditional Arabic music playing, where the 5, 7, 10 instruments play exactly the same melody for a long time, juxtaposed against a drone that gives you the home key, if you want, while the other instruments just play with slight differences. So I hope you'll hear that in the piece. It's not too long, so it's not very slow and too long. It's not too long. I hope you enjoy. This is movement number 1 from Essays on Solitude and Other Ambiguous Emotions.
Thank you so much for this performance, for sharing your stories with us. We definitely want to hear the rest of the piece now. So we'll be here on Thursday to hear that. And the Claremont Trio is also performing on Friday night this week. So it's another big week of music. I hope that you'll join us for a glass of wine. We can ask each other questions and share more about the stories of the music we've heard today. So thank you, everyone.